I want you to imagine something for a moment. You wake up tomorrow morning, walk into your bathroom, and look in the mirror to brush your teeth. But instead of seeing yourself preparing for the day, you see yourself choking to death on your own blood. Your reflection is gasping for air, clawing at its throat, eyes bulging with terror as life drains from its face. You blink, step back, look again, and now you're seeing yourself falling down a flight of stairs, neck snapping at an impossible angle. This isn't imagination for me. This has been my reality for the past 8 months, and it's destroyed every aspect of my life. My name is Marcus. I'm 28 years old, and I live in Phoenix, Arizona. 6 months ago, I covered every mirror in my house with sheets and towels. I avoid reflective surfaces like they're radioactive. I haven't seen my own face clearly in half a year, and honestly, I'm terrified of what I might see if I ever look again. It started in January of this year, with something so subtle that I almost dismissed it entirely. I was getting ready for work on a Tuesday morning, standing in front of my bathroom mirror while I shaved. As I moved the razor across my jaw, I noticed something strange. My reflection seemed to be moving just a fraction of a second behind my actual movements. It was so slight that I convinced myself it was just fatigue, or maybe a problem with the lighting in my bathroom. But over the next few days, the delay became more noticeable. When I would raise my hand, my reflection would raise its hand a beat later. When I smiled, my reflection would smile after a pause, like it was copying me rather than being me. I started paying closer attention, timing the delay with the second hand on my watch. What had started as barely perceptible lag grew to nearly a full second of delay between my movements and what I saw in the mirror. Let me know in the comments if you've ever noticed anything strange about your reflection, because what I experienced next made me realize that mirrors might show us far more than we're supposed to see. The first time I saw myself die was on January 15th, a date that's burned into my memory forever. I was in my kitchen making coffee before work when I glanced at the reflection in the chrome surface of my refrigerator. Instead of seeing myself reaching for a mug, I saw my reflection clutching its chest, face contorted in agony, collapsing to the floor in what was clearly a massive heart attack. The vision lasted only a few seconds before the surface returned to normal, showing my regular reflection reaching for the coffee mug as if nothing had happened. I stood there staring at the refrigerator, my hand frozen halfway to the cabinet, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My rational mind immediately began searching for explanations: stress from work, lack of sleep, maybe a migraine aura that was causing visual disturbances. I had no family history of heart problems. I was young and relatively healthy, and I'd never experienced anything like hallucinations before. But the image had been so vivid, so realistic, that I couldn't shake the feeling that I had genuinely witnessed my own death. The reflection's face had shown pain and terror that seemed impossible to generate from my subconscious imagination. Every detail was perfect. The way my body had convulsed, the exact expression of surprise and agony, even the way my reflection had fallen, hitting the kitchen counter on the way down. I called in sick to work that day and spent hours researching everything I could find about visual hallucinations, mirror-related supernatural phenomena, and medical conditions that might cause someone to see disturbing images in reflective surfaces. Most of what I found fell into two categories: scientific explanations related to neurological conditions or psychiatric disorders, and paranormal accounts that I wasn't ready to consider seriously. The medical explanations were disturbing in their own way. Visual hallucinations could be symptoms of brain tumors, schizophrenia, severe depression, or various other conditions that I definitely didn't want to have. I made an appointment with my doctor for later that week, but I also secretly hoped that the incident had been a one-time occurrence brought on by stress or exhaustion. That hope was destroyed 3 days later, when I saw myself die for the second time. I was brushing my teeth before bed, trying to ignore the delayed movements of my reflection that had now become a constant, unsettling feature of looking in mirrors. As I rinsed my mouth, I glanced up at the mirror and saw my reflection underwater, drowning. My reflection was thrashing desperately, mouth open in a silent scream, bubbles streaming from my nose as I sank deeper into what appeared to be murky lake water. The terror in my reflection's eyes was absolute, the primal panic of someone who knew they were going to die and could do nothing to stop it. This vision lasted longer than the heart attack scene, nearly 10 seconds of watching myself drown while I stood safely in my bathroom with toothpaste foam around my mouth. When the image returned to normal, I was so shaken that I dropped my toothbrush and had to sit down on the edge of my bathtub to keep from collapsing. The drowning vision was different from the heart attack in important ways. The first death had seemed to take place in my kitchen, in a familiar environment where such a medical emergency was at least theoretically possible. But the drowning scene was clearly happening somewhere else entirely. A large body of dark water that didn't correspond to anywhere I had been recently. It was as if my reflection was showing me death scenarios from multiple possible futures, or perhaps from parallel versions of my life where different fatal events were unfolding. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because what happened over the next few weeks convinced me that these weren't random hallucinations. They were warnings about dangers that I needed to take seriously. My doctor's appointment on January 22nd was both reassuring and deeply frustrating. Dr. Yu, Sarah Chen was thorough and professional, conducting a complete neurological examination and ordering blood tests to rule out various medical conditions that could cause visual disturbances. She also referred me to an ophthalmologist to check for retinal problems and scheduled an MRI to examine my brain for any structural abnormalities. When I described the death visions I had been seeing in mirrors, Dr. Chen listened carefully, but maintained the clinical detachment that I had expected from a medical professional. She explained that visual hallucinations, while disturbing, were not uncommon and could be triggered by stress, lack of sleep, certain medications, or underlying medical conditions that the tests would help identify. The specificity of what you're describing, seeing yourself in life-threatening situations, suggests that anxiety might be playing a significant role in these experiences, Dr. Chen explained. Sometimes our minds create visual representations of our deepest fears, particularly when we're under stress or going through difficult periods in our lives. I wanted to believe her rational explanation, but I also knew that I hadn't been experiencing unusual stress levels, and the visions felt far too detailed and realistic to be products of an anxious imagination. Still, I agreed to follow her recommendations and wait for the test results before considering other possibilities. The MRI came back completely normal, showing no signs of tumors, lesions, or structural abnormalities that could account for the visual disturbances. My blood work was equally unremarkable, and the ophthalmological examination revealed no retinal problems or other eye-related issues that might cause hallucinations. From a medical standpoint, I was perfectly healthy, but the death visions were becoming more frequent and more detailed. By the end of January, I was seeing myself die almost every time I looked in a mirror or other reflective surface. The scenarios varied wildly. Car accidents, falls from high places, violent attacks, medical emergencies, even bizarre accidents like electrocution or poisoning. Each death was unique, vivid, and terrifying, lasting anywhere from a few seconds to nearly a minute. What made these visions particularly disturbing was how realistic they appeared. These weren't cartoonish or obviously supernatural images. They looked exactly like what I imagined real death would look like. The fear in my reflection's eyes, the physical trauma, the way my body moved during these fatal scenarios, everything was perfectly convincing and horribly detailed. I began keeping a journal of each death vision, recording the date, time, location where I saw it, and detailed descriptions of how my reflection died. By February 1st, I had documented 14 different deaths, ranging from mundane accidents to elaborate murder scenarios. The variety was staggering, but what concerned me most was that some of the deaths seemed to be providing specific warnings about actual dangers in my environment. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because the pattern I discovered in my death visions revealed something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality and time. Paragraph 2, 2,000 words. February brought an escalation that forced me to confront the possibility that what I was seeing in mirrors wasn't just hallucinations or symptoms of an undiagnosed medical condition. The death visions were becoming prophetic, showing me specific dangers that I later encountered in real life, and some of them saved my life in ways that couldn't be explained by coincidence or subconscious awareness. The first prophetic vision occurred on February 3rd. I was getting dressed for work, glancing in my bedroom mirror, when I saw my reflection being hit by a red pickup truck while crossing a street. The vision was incredibly specific. I could see the license plate number, the make and model of the truck, even the face of the driver who looked shocked and horrified as he realized he was about to hit someone. My reflection flew through the air, landed hard on the pavement, and lay motionless with blood pooling around its head. At the time, I assumed it was just another random death scenario generated by whatever was causing these disturbing visions. I had no immediate plans to cross any busy streets, and the intersection shown in the vision wasn't one I recognized. I wrote down the details in my journal and went about my normal routine, trying not to think about the vivid image of my own violent death. Later that afternoon, I received a call from my sister asking if I could pick her up from a mechanic's shop across town where her car was being repaired. The shop was located on a busy street that I rarely traveled, but I agreed to help her out. When I arrived at the location, I realized with a shock of recognition that I was standing at the exact intersection I had seen in my morning death vision. The traffic pattern, the surrounding buildings, even the position of the crosswalk matched perfectly with what my reflection had shown me. I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, scanning the traffic for a red pickup truck, feeling ridiculous but also genuinely nervous about crossing the street. My sister called to say she would be ready in about 10 minutes, so I decided to wait inside the mechanic's shop rather than risk crossing to the coffee shop on the other side. About 5 minutes later, I heard the screech of brakes and a loud crash outside. A red pickup truck, the same make, model, and color I had seen in my vision, had run a red light and collided with another vehicle in the intersection. If I had been crossing the street at that moment, I would have been exactly where the accident occurred. The license plate number was off by 2 digits from what I had seen in the vision, but the driver looked remarkably similar to the shocked face I had observed in my bedroom mirror that morning. The timing wasn't perfect either. The accident happened about 10 minutes later than when I would have been crossing if I had arrived and immediately gone to the coffee shop as originally planned. Let me know in the comments if you want me to investigate this further, because what I experienced over the next few weeks suggested that the mirror visions weren't just showing me random possible deaths. They were showing me actual future events that I could potentially avoid if I paid attention to the warnings. This incident fundamentally changed how I viewed the death visions. Instead of treating them as symptoms of a medical or psychiatric condition, I began to consider the possibility that I was somehow seeing glimpses of future events through mirrors and reflective surfaces. The implications were both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it meant I was genuinely seeing my own death over and over again, but comforting because it suggested I might be able to avoid these fatal scenarios if I recognized the warnings in time. I started paying much closer attention to the details in each vision, looking for specific locations, times of day, clothing I was wearing, or other environmental clues that might help me identify when and where these dangerous situations might occur. I also began changing my behavior based on what I saw, avoiding certain activities or locations that appeared in the death scenarios. On February 8th, I saw myself falling down a flight of concrete stairs outside what appeared to be an office building, hitting my head and breaking my neck. The vision showed me wearing a specific blue shirt and carrying a leather briefcase that I recognized as my own. 2 days later, I had a job interview scheduled at a downtown office building that required climbing a steep set of outdoor concrete stairs to reach the main entrance. I almost canceled the interview based on the vision, but I needed the job and decided instead to be extremely careful. I wore different clothing than what I had seen in the vision, left my briefcase in the car, and took the stairs very slowly while holding tightly to the handrail. Halfway up the staircase, I noticed that several of the concrete steps were wet from a recent cleaning, making them slippery and dangerous. If I had been rushing up the stairs in dress shoes while carrying a heavy briefcase, I could easily have fallen exactly as my reflection had shown me. The interview went well, and I got the job, but the experience reinforced my growing belief that the mirror visions were providing genuine warnings about future dangers. However, this created a new problem. If I was seeing real future events, why was I seeing so many different death scenarios? Was I destined to die multiple times? Or was I observing different possible outcomes based on the choices I made? The answer to this question came through a series of visions that showed me the same basic death scenario with slight variations. Throughout the second week of February, I repeatedly saw myself dying in car accidents, but the details changed each time I looked. Sometimes I was the driver, sometimes the passenger. Sometimes the accident was caused by another car running a red light, sometimes by mechanical failure, sometimes by weather conditions. The location, time of day, and circumstances varied, but the core event, death in a car accident, remained consistent. This pattern suggested that the mirror visions weren't showing me a single predetermined future, but rather multiple possible outcomes based on different choices and circumstances. It was as if I was seeing a range of potential deaths that could occur if certain conditions aligned, and my actions could influence which scenario, if any, actually came to pass. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because the scientific and supernatural implications of seeing multiple possible futures through reflective surfaces challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of time and causality. By the end of February, I had documented over 40 different death visions, and I had successfully avoided at least 3 situations that could have resulted in serious injury or death. The red pickup truck incident, the slippery stairs, and a third scenario involving food poisoning from a restaurant that I decided not to visit after seeing myself violently ill and dying from what appeared to be severe gastroenteritis. But avoiding the dangers shown in the visions came with a significant psychological cost. I was becoming increasingly paranoid and anxious, constantly scanning my environment for potential threats that might match what I had seen in mirrors. I couldn't look at my reflection without seeing another death scenario, which meant that simple activities like brushing my teeth, shaving, or getting dressed became sources of stress and dread. My social life began to suffer as I became reluctant to leave my house or engage in activities that might put me in situations I had seen in the visions. I canceled dates, skipped social events, and even called in sick to work when I had seen death scenarios that seemed to involve my workplace or commute. Friends and family began to notice my increasingly erratic behavior, but I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding like I was having a psychological breakdown. Dr. Chen referred me to a psychiatrist after I described the prophetic nature of some of the visions during a follow-up appointment. Dr. Michael Torres was a compassionate and experienced mental health professional who listened carefully to my accounts of the mirror phenomena without immediately dismissing them as delusions or hallucinations. What you're describing could be a form of anxiety-based hypervigilance, Dr. Torres explained during our first session. Sometimes people who are under extreme stress develop an enhanced sensitivity to potential dangers in their environment. Your mind might be processing subtle visual and auditory cues that your conscious awareness doesn't register, then presenting that information to you in the form of vivid scenarios that feel prophetic. This explanation made sense from a psychological standpoint, but it didn't account for the specific accuracy of details I had seen in visions like the red pickup truck accident or the wet stairs at the office building. I was processing information that I couldn't have consciously known, and the visions were showing me events that hadn't happened yet with remarkable precision. Dr. Torres prescribed anti-anxiety medication and recommended cognitive behavioral therapy to help me develop coping strategies for dealing with the intrusive visions. The medication did reduce my overall anxiety level, but it had no effect on the frequency or intensity of the death visions themselves. If anything, the visions became clearer and more detailed as my general anxiety decreased. March brought a new development that convinced me that what I was experiencing went far beyond anxiety or hypervigilance. The death visions began showing me not just my own deaths, but the deaths of other people. And some of these visions proved to be just as prophetically accurate as the ones involving myself. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section, because what the mirror visions revealed about other people's fates made me realize that I might be witnessing something far more significant than personal premonitions. Paragraph 3, 2,000 words. March 5th was the day I realized that the mirror phenomenon was much larger and more complex than my personal experience with prophetic death visions. I was in a public restroom at a shopping mall, trying to avoid looking directly at the mirrors above the sinks, when I caught a glimpse of a reflection that wasn't mine. Instead of seeing my own face, I saw a middle-aged woman with gray hair and a red jacket choking on what appeared to be food, her face turning blue as she clawed desperately at her throat. The vision lasted only a few seconds, but it was just as vivid and detailed as the death scenarios I had been seeing of myself. When I looked again, the mirror showed my normal reflection, but I was deeply disturbed by the experience. This was the first time the mirrors had shown me someone else's death, and I had no idea what it meant, or what, if anything, I should do about it. I left the restroom shaken and spent the rest of my time at the mall unconsciously scanning the crowd for a woman matching the description from the vision. About 20 minutes later, while I was sitting in the food court trying to calm down, I heard commotion from the restaurant area. A woman in a red jacket, the same woman I had seen in the mirror, was indeed choking on her food. Several people rushed to help her, and fortunately, someone who knew the Heimlich maneuver was able to dislodge whatever was blocking her airway before she lost consciousness. She survived the incident, though she was taken to the hospital as a precaution. The timing and details matched my vision perfectly, except that in the mirror, I had seen her die from the choking, whereas in reality, she was saved by the quick actions of a bystander. This experience raised disturbing new questions about the nature of what I was seeing in mirrors. If the visions could show me other people's deaths as well as my own, was I somehow tapping into a broader stream of information about future events? Were the mirrors showing me what would happen without intervention, or were they displaying just one possible outcome among many? Over the next few weeks, I began seeing death visions of strangers with increasing frequency. Some I was able to identify later, like the choking woman, while others remained abstract figures whose fates I couldn't verify. The visions showed deaths from all causes: accidents, medical emergencies, violence, even natural disasters. Each scenario was as detailed and realistic as my personal death visions had been. On March 12th, I saw a young man in a blue baseball cap falling from a construction scaffolding, his hard hat flying off as he plummeted toward concrete far below. 3 days later, while driving past a construction site, I recognized the same man working on scaffolding that looked identical to what I had seen in the vision. I pulled over and called the construction company's emergency number, claiming I had seen someone working unsafely and was concerned about an accident. The supervisor who responded to my call was initially skeptical, but agreed to check the scaffolding where I had indicated the worker was located. They discovered that several of the safety cables were improperly secured and could have failed under stress, potentially causing exactly the type of fall I had witnessed in the mirror. The worker was moved to a different area while the scaffolding was repaired, possibly preventing the accident I had foreseen. These experiences convinced me that I was somehow accessing information about future events through reflective surfaces, but the psychological burden of seeing constant death visions was becoming unbearable. I was witnessing dozens of potential tragedies every day, most involving people I didn't know and couldn't help. The helplessness of seeing someone's death in a mirror while having no practical way to warn them or change the outcome was emotionally devastating. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story, because what I learned about the true nature of mirrors and reflective surfaces will change how you view every reflective surface you encounter. I began researching the historical and cultural significance of mirrors in supernatural contexts, hoping to find some precedent for what I was experiencing. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Cultures throughout history have attributed supernatural properties to mirrors and reflective surfaces, believing them to be portals to other dimensions, windows into the future, or gateways through which spirits could manifest in the physical world. Ancient Greek and Roman cultures believed that mirrors could trap souls and that breaking a mirror would result in 7 years of bad luck because it damaged the soul's reflection. Medieval European folklore described mirrors as tools used by witches and seers to glimpse future events or communicate with supernatural entities. Asian cultures have extensive traditions around mirror magic, including beliefs that mirrors can reveal true forms hidden by illusion or deception. More relevant to my experiences were historical accounts of people claiming to see prophetic visions in mirrors, crystal balls, and other reflective surfaces. These accounts, often dismissed as superstition or fraud, described phenomena remarkably similar to what I was experiencing. Detailed visions of future events, particularly deaths and disasters, viewed through reflective media. The consistency of these historical reports across different cultures and time periods suggested that mirror-based precognition might be a genuine phenomenon that science hadn't adequately studied or understood. If some individuals possessed natural psychic abilities that allowed them to perceive future events, reflective surfaces might serve as focusing tools that enhanced or channeled these perceptions. But accepting this supernatural explanation raised new questions about the nature of time, causality, and free will. If future events could be observed before they occurred, did that mean the future was predetermined, or were the visions showing possible outcomes that could be changed through intervention? My experiences with both personal and stranger visions suggested that the future might be malleable. I had successfully avoided several of my own predicted deaths, and the choking woman had been saved despite the vision showing her dying. By the end of March, the frequency and intensity of the death visions had reached a level that was severely impacting my ability to function normally. I was seeing multiple death scenarios every day, involving both myself and strangers, and the emotional toll of witnessing constant tragedy was pushing me toward a psychological breakdown. I couldn't eat at restaurants without seeing visions of food poisoning, couldn't drive without seeing car accidents, couldn't walk downstairs without seeing falls. Dr. Torres increased my medication dosage and recommended more frequent therapy sessions, but the visions continued unabated. We discussed the possibility of hospitalization if my condition continued to deteriorate, but I was reluctant to give up my freedom and independence, especially since I believed the visions were providing genuine warnings about real dangers. The breaking point came on March 28th when I saw a vision that was more detailed, more vivid, and more emotionally devastating than anything I had experienced before. While brushing my teeth, I looked up at my bathroom mirror and saw a scene of mass tragedy. A crowded building collapsing with dozens of people trapped inside, their faces filled with terror as they realized they were going to die. The vision lasted nearly 2 minutes, long enough for me to see individual faces, hear phantom screams, and witness the horrible details of multiple simultaneous deaths. What made this vision particularly disturbing was that I recognized the building. It was a local shopping center where I often went for groceries and other errands. The architectural details, the store layouts, even the specific areas where I saw people trapped, all matched the real building perfectly. If this vision was prophetic like the others, it suggested that a catastrophic structural failure was going to occur at a location I visited regularly. I spent the rest of that day researching the building's construction history, looking for any signs of structural problems or safety violations that might support the possibility of a collapse. What I found was troubling. The shopping center had been built in the 1970s using construction methods that were later found to be inadequate for earthquake resistance, and there had been several minor structural issues reported over the years that had been patched rather than properly repaired. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because the decision I made about whether to warn people about the potential building collapse would determine whether I was a prophet trying to save lives or a mentally ill person spreading dangerous panic. Paragraph 4, 2,000 words. The vision of the shopping center collapse forced me to confront a moral dilemma that had been building throughout my experience with the death visions. If I truly was seeing future events, did I have a responsibility to warn people about potential disasters? Even if doing so might result in me being dismissed as mentally ill or even arrested for making terroristic threats. The weight of potentially having foreknowledge about a tragedy that could kill dozens of people was overwhelming. I spent sleepless nights trying to decide what to do with the information I had seen in the mirror. On one hand, if the vision was accurate and I did nothing, people would die who might have been saved if I had found a way to warn them. On the other hand, if I was wrong, if the visions were indeed hallucinations caused by mental illness, then spreading panic about a building collapse could cause serious harm, including economic damage to the shopping center and psychological trauma to people who believed they were in danger. After much deliberation, I decided to take a middle approach. Rather than making a public announcement or contacting the media about a predicted building collapse, I would report my concerns to the city's building inspection department as a concerned citizen who had noticed potential structural problems. This would allow qualified professionals to evaluate the building's safety without creating public panic. And if there were genuine structural issues, they would be discovered through official channels. On April 2nd, I called the Phoenix Building Inspection Department and reported that I had observed what I believed to be structural irregularities at the shopping center. I mentioned the building's age, the construction methods used in the 1970s, and my concerns about earthquake safety, but I didn't mention the mirror visions or claim any psychic knowledge about a future collapse. The inspector I spoke with was professional and assured me that they would schedule a safety evaluation of the building. The inspection took place 2 weeks later, and the results were both vindicating and terrifying. The structural engineers discovered several serious problems with the building's foundation and support systems that had been hidden by cosmetic renovations over the years. The issues were severe enough that the shopping center was immediately closed to the public pending major structural repairs that would take several months to complete. According to the inspection report that was later made public, the building had been at significant risk of partial collapse, particularly in the event of an earthquake or other structural stress. The problems weren't immediately life-threatening under normal circumstances, but the engineers concluded that a major disaster could have occurred if the issues hadn't been addressed. The shopping center remained closed for 7 months, while extensive structural reinforcement was completed. During that time, I couldn't help but wonder whether I had prevented the tragedy I had seen in the mirror, or whether the vision had been showing me what would happen if the structural problems weren't discovered and repaired. Either way, my decision to report my concerns had potentially saved lives, even though I couldn't take credit for the intervention without revealing the supernatural source of my knowledge. But preventing one potential tragedy didn't stop the death visions from continuing. If anything, they became more frequent and more intense throughout April and May. I was seeing multiple deaths every day: car accidents, medical emergencies, workplace accidents, violent crimes, and natural disasters. The vast majority involved strangers whose identities I couldn't determine, leaving me helpless to intervene or provide warnings. The psychological impact of witnessing constant death became unbearable. I was suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and what appeared to be symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder from viewing hundreds of traumatic scenarios. Sleep became impossible as the visions invaded my dreams, showing me the same death scenes on repeat throughout the night. I lost weight, became socially isolated, and found it increasingly difficult to perform basic daily activities. Dr. Iaz. Torres recommended hospitalization for intensive psychiatric treatment, but I was terrified of being medicated to the point where the visions would stop entirely. Despite the psychological torture they caused, I had come to believe that the death visions served an important purpose, providing warnings about genuine dangers that could potentially be avoided. If medication suppressed my ability to see these warnings, people might die who could have been saved. This internal conflict between wanting relief from the visions and feeling responsible for the lives that might be lost if I couldn't see future dangers created a psychological trap that I couldn't escape. I was being destroyed by information that might be saving lives, but I couldn't find a way to use that information effectively without destroying my credibility and potentially my freedom. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because what happened in late May when the death visions suddenly changed their nature revealed the final, most terrifying truth about what I was really seeing in mirrors. The transformation of the visions began on May 23rd with what I initially thought was a malfunction in my bathroom mirror. Instead of showing me a death scenario when I looked at my reflection, the mirror displayed what appeared to be a live video feed of myself from a different angle, as if a camera were positioned behind and slightly above me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there, just the blank wall of my bathroom. This new type of vision was deeply unsettling because it suggested that the mirrors weren't just showing me possible future events, but were somehow capable of displaying real-time imagery from perspectives that didn't correspond to physical reality. It was as if I were being observed and recorded by invisible entities that existed within or beyond the reflective surfaces. Over the next few days, these surveillance-style visions became more common than the death scenarios. I would look in mirrors and see myself from impossible angles, from above, from inside walls, from positions where no camera could physically exist. Sometimes the mirrors showed me locations in my house that I wasn't currently occupying, displaying empty rooms from viewpoints that defied the laws of physics. But the most disturbing development was when the mirrors began showing me other people in my house when I knew I was alone. I would look in my bathroom mirror and see strangers walking through my living room, opening my refrigerator, sitting on my couch as if they belonged there. These figures weren't reflections or visions of death. They appeared to be real people moving through my home in real time, but when I ran to check those rooms, they were always empty. The surveillance visions escalated rapidly throughout late May. I began seeing myself sleeping from angles that showed someone or something was watching me from positions where no human could physically stand. The mirrors displayed footage of me eating, working, even using the bathroom, all captured from impossible vantage points that suggested I was being continuously monitored by invisible observers. What made these new visions particularly terrifying was that they seemed to be documenting my daily life rather than predicting future events. Unlike the death scenarios, which showed possible futures that I could potentially avoid, these surveillance visions appeared to be showing me what was actually happening in real time. I was being watched, recorded, and studied by entities that could observe me from any angle they chose, regardless of physical limitations. By early June, I had reached a breaking point that forced me to take drastic action. The combination of death visions showing multiple daily tragedies and surveillance visions revealing that I was being constantly observed had pushed me beyond what any human psyche could endure. I couldn't sleep, eat, or perform basic functions without being reminded that malevolent forces were using mirrors to monitor every aspect of my existence. On June 3rd, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I systematically destroyed every reflective surface in my house. Using a hammer, I shattered every mirror, covered every window with black paint, and replaced all reflective appliances with older, non-reflective models. The process took an entire day and left my home looking like a cave, but for the first time in months, I experienced complete visual silence. The immediate relief was overwhelming. Without mirrors or reflective surfaces to trigger the visions, I could move through my house without seeing death scenarios or surveillance footage. I could brush my teeth, shower, and get dressed without being confronted with images of my own demise or evidence of invisible watchers. For the first time since January, I felt like I had control over my visual environment. But the relief came with significant costs. Living without mirrors or reflective surfaces meant I couldn't see my own appearance, which created practical challenges for basic grooming and self-care. More troubling was the growing sense that I was hiding from something important rather than solving the underlying problem. The death visions had saved my life on multiple occasions and had potentially prevented a building collapse that could have killed dozens of people. By eliminating my ability to see these warnings, Was I putting myself and others at greater risk? The psychological impact of my self-imposed visual isolation became apparent within weeks. Without the constant stress of death visions, I initially felt better, but I also became obsessed with the possibility that I was missing crucial warnings about future dangers. Every time I left my house, I wondered if I was walking into a situation that my mirrors would have warned me about. Every news report of an accident or disaster made me question whether I could have prevented it if I had still been receiving visions. Dr. Torres was deeply concerned about my decision to destroy all reflective surfaces in my home. During our sessions, he characterized it as an extreme avoidance behavior that was likely to reinforce my fears rather than address the underlying psychological issues causing the visions. By destroying the mirrors, you're essentially validating the belief that they were showing you real supernatural phenomena, Dr. Torres explained. This kind of accommodation behavior often makes anxiety disorders worse over time because it prevents you from learning that your fears are unfounded. But I knew something that Dr. Torres didn't. The visions had been demonstrably accurate on multiple occasions. The red pickup truck accident, the slippery stairs, the building collapse, and dozens of other scenarios had provided genuine warnings about real dangers. Dismissing these experiences as anxiety-induced hallucinations ignored the overwhelming evidence that I had been accessing information about future events through reflective surfaces. The conflict between the psychiatric explanation for my experiences and the demonstrable accuracy of many visions created an impossible situation. I couldn't convince mental health professionals that the phenomena were real without appearing to have lost touch with reality. But I also couldn't ignore the evidence that the mirror visions had saved lives, including my own. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar with your own reflective surfaces, because what I discovered during my months without mirrors revealed the true price of cutting off supernatural communication. Living in a house without reflective surfaces created an unexpected side effect. I began seeing the death visions in other places. Storefront windows, car windshields, the surface of puddles after rain, even the black screen of my turned-off television all began displaying the same type of prophetic images I had seen in mirrors. It was as if whatever force was communicating through reflective surfaces had adapted to my avoidance behavior and was finding new ways to deliver its warnings. This development confirmed my growing suspicion that the mirror phenomenon wasn't limited to actual mirrors, but could manifest through any reflective surface under the right conditions. The entities or forces responsible for the visions were persistent and resourceful, capable of using virtually any reflective medium to continue their communication attempts. By July, I realized that my strategy of avoiding reflective surfaces was ultimately futile. The modern world is filled with reflective materials. Windows, screens, polished metal, even the surface of water, and completely avoiding all of them was practically impossible. More importantly, the return of the death visions through alternative surfaces suggested that I hadn't solved the underlying problem, merely forced it to find new manifestation methods. The most disturbing aspect of the vision's persistence was what it implied about my role in this supernatural phenomenon. If the entities communicating through reflective surfaces were willing to adapt their methods to maintain contact with me, it suggested that I served a specific purpose in their agenda. I wasn't just a random victim experiencing hallucinations. I was a chosen conduit for information that these forces considered important enough to preserve at any cost. This realization forced me to confront the possibility that I couldn't escape the mirror phenomenon by avoiding reflective surfaces. Whatever was causing the death visions had selected me for reasons I didn't understand, and it would continue finding ways to communicate regardless of my attempts to cut off contact. The question was no longer how to stop the visions, but how to live with them while preserving my sanity and using the information responsibly. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because my final attempt to understand and control the mirror phenomenon led to discoveries about the nature of reality that most people are never meant to learn. Paragraph 5, 2,000 words. By August, I had reached a crossroads that would determine the rest of my life. I could continue trying to avoid reflective surfaces while the visions found new ways to manifest, slowly driving me insane as I lived in fear of what I might see. Or I could accept that this supernatural phenomenon was permanent and find a way to coexist with it while using the information it provided to help people whenever possible. The decision was made for me on August 15th, when I saw a death vision in a store window that was too specific and too urgent to ignore. While walking past the electronics store, I caught a glimpse of the reflection in the display window and saw a detailed vision of a school bus accident involving children from the local elementary school. The vision showed the exact bus route, the specific intersection where the accident would occur, and even the license plate number of the truck that would run the red light and cause the collision. Unlike my earlier visions that had shown single deaths or small-scale tragedies, this one involved the potential deaths of dozens of children. The moral weight of having advanced knowledge about such a catastrophic event was overwhelming. I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing and those children died, but I also couldn't figure out how to warn authorities about a predicted accident without sounding like I was making terroristic threats. After hours of internal struggle, I decided to call in an anonymous tip to the school district, claiming that I had witnessed a truck driver behaving dangerously near the bus route and was concerned about student safety. I provided the specific intersection where I had seen the accident occur and described the truck from my vision in detail. The call resulted in increased police presence along that route for several days and additional safety briefings for the bus drivers. 3 days after my call, a truck matching the description from my vision ran a red light at the exact intersection I had identified. However, because of the increased police presence and safety measures, the school bus driver was able to stop in time and the accident was avoided. The truck driver was arrested for reckless driving and later found to be under the influence of illegal drugs. This incident convinced me that the death visions served a genuine protective purpose, providing advance warnings about tragedies that could potentially be prevented through appropriate intervention. The challenge was finding ways to act on this information without revealing the supernatural source of my knowledge or appearing mentally unstable to authorities and mental health professionals. Over the following months, I developed a system for managing the mirror phenomenon that allowed me to function while still receiving and acting on the visions when necessary. I accepted that I would continue seeing death scenarios in reflective surfaces for the rest of my life, but I also learned to distinguish between visions that required action and those that were simply showing me one of many possible futures. Personal death visions that showed specific, avoidable dangers, like the red pickup truck or slippery stairs, prompted immediate behavior changes to avoid those scenarios. Visions involving other people required more careful consideration, as I had to balance the potential for saving lives against the risk of being perceived as mentally ill or dangerous by authorities. I also learned that not all death visions were meant to be prevented. Some appeared to show natural deaths or unavoidable tragedies that served as reminders of human mortality rather than warnings about preventable dangers. Learning to distinguish between actionable warnings and inevitable outcomes became a crucial skill for managing the psychological impact of constant exposure to death scenarios. The surveillance visions proved to be the most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon, as they suggested that invisible entities were continuously monitoring my activities through reflective surfaces. However, I gradually came to understand that this observation wasn't necessarily malevolent. The entities appeared to be studying how I responded to the death visions and learning how to communicate more effectively through reflective media. As months passed, the visions became more selective and focused, showing me primarily scenarios where intervention was possible and effective, rather than overwhelming me with constant imagery of unavoidable tragedies. It was as if the entities responsible for the phenomenon had learned to tailor their communications to maximize the usefulness of the information while minimizing the psychological damage to their chosen conduit. By the end of the year, I had helped prevent at least 6 major accidents or tragedies through anonymous tips and warnings based on information from the mirror visions. A building collapse, 2 car accidents involving fatalities, a workplace industrial accident, a case of food poisoning at a restaurant, and a fire at a nursing home were all avoided or minimized through interventions based on what I had seen in reflective surfaces. The psychological cost of serving as a conduit for supernatural warnings remained significant. I continued to struggle with depression, anxiety, and the social isolation that came from being unable to explain my unusual behavior to friends and family. Relationships became impossible to maintain when I couldn't share the truth about why I sometimes canceled plans or avoided certain locations and activities. Dr. Torres continued to work with me on developing coping strategies, though he remained convinced that the visions were symptoms of a complex psychological disorder rather than genuine supernatural phenomena. Our sessions focused on managing the emotional impact of the intrusive imagery rather than questioning their reality, which allowed me to continue receiving professional mental health support without having to convince him of the vision's authenticity. The most difficult aspect of living with the mirror phenomenon was the knowledge that I would never be able to live a completely normal life. Every reflective surface remained a potential source of disturbing imagery, and I could never be certain when a routine glance at a mirror might reveal a tragedy that I would feel morally obligated to prevent.